Good afternoon. I'm Holly Work, a 2009 management major. Our sponsor for today is Assurant, and our webcasting partner is Impact Media Solutions. Our guest today is David Bornstein, author of How to Change the World. It is the first book to be written about social entrepreneurs. How to Change the World is labeled a must-read by the New York Times and has been published in over 20 different countries. His book focuses on the importance of innovative ideas and the people who create, develop, and inspire social change. Mr. Bornstein explores stories of successful businessmen and women who are trying to solve global problems today through social entrepreneurship. David Bornstein has a Bachelor of Commerce from McGill University and a Master of the Arts from NYU. He grew up in Montreal and now resides in New York with his wife and son. His works have been inspired by his extensive travels to Bangladesh, India, Brazil, and Eastern Europe. His book shows the idea that one person with determination and innovation can bring positive change to thousands, even millions of people. I challenge us to have the drive to change the world and ourselves. So please give a warm Georgia Tech welcome to our guest, David Bornstein.
Thank you, Holly. Thanks, Holly. So there's this quote by a journalist named Walter Lippmann who was writing at the early part of the 20th century. And he said, the way that we imagine the world will determine, to a large degree, what we do. So if we try to imagine the world today and we rely upon the traditional information sources that we get, if you read the New York Times or if you read, if you watch CNN or ABC News, you have a sense that the world is full of a lot of very destabilizing people committing crimes, terrorists, people involved in scandals, and then, of course, you have a lot of celebrities. 2,200 journalists covered the trial of Michael Jackson last year. And then there's this whole other landscape of human activity out there that is completely unreported on, and that's really what I've been focusing on for the last 16 years. It's what we call this field of social entrepreneurship. I graduated from McGill University in Montreal 1985, I'm ashamed to say, and really I had never heard of social entrepreneurship. I didn't even think that there was any kind of career that I could have other than I thought I would be maybe a doctor, maybe a lawyer, or start my own computer business, because in 1985 was the year that Windows was launched, and of course everybody was very excited about what that was going to mean for people. So I went into computers thinking, well, this was probably my best option. I wanted to make a lot of money. I was very specific. I wanted to be a millionaire and own a Jaguar. It was like picture it. It was a blue Jaguar. And so I went into computers and I became a programmer, and I worked for a very good company in Montreal that was, I don't know if those of you know the store Barney's, but it's a big chain in New York. I mean, it's a big, very elite sort of store. So I programmed Barney's inventory system, one of their basic inventory systems. I was very proud of that. But after about 4 years of working in the computer company, I kind of felt like I wasn't really doing something that made me feel turned on about life, that made me feel like I was really living my life. So I did what I think was the best decision, took what I thought was the best decision I ever took, was I just went to travel, to backpack around the world for 12 months. And I started off in Tahiti, and I went to the Cook Islands, Fiji, New Zealand, Australia, and then spent 6 months in Southeast Asia. And when I came back to Montreal, and I came back on the day that my ticket was going to expire, I had a 1-year ticket, I remember thinking, I can't go back to the job that I had before. Something was really stirred in me. So I decided that, I said, what kind of a job could I have where I would really learn about the world, where my job would be to learn about the world and see the things that I had seen in this 12 months of backpacking. And so I decided that I would become a writer, and I moved to New York City and became a journalist and started writing I did a master's in journalism, and then started working for New York City newspapers. New York Newsday was the one I worked for. And I did that for about a year and a half, almost 2 years, and I started getting the same feelings that I had had when I was working at the computer company, because a lot of the stories that I was covering for Newsday were really based on the stuff that I described before, the way the world is presented to us. I was covering a lot of murders. Anytime I ever went into East New York or the South Bronx, it was because somebody had killed somebody. They never sent us there to do other reporting. We covered the mayoralty race. Mayor Dinkins was running against Rudy Giuliani then in 1989, and of course it was lots of stories of politicians saying things, and then insider stories of scandals and corruption and this sort of thing. And I remember feeling very disenchanted with this. And one day, a friend of mine told me that they were going to be working on a TV documentary about an organization called the Grameen Bank of Bangladesh. How many people here have heard of the Grameen Bank? Okay, so well, if I say the organization that won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006, that lends money to women in villages in Bangladesh, maybe have more of you heard about it, even though you don't know the name Grameen Bank? Okay, so a few more hands. So I heard about this organization, and I had studied business, and I thought, they actually lend money to villagers in Bangladesh. The loan sizes were less than $100 a year. I remember thinking, I'd studied business, this can't be financially sustainable. You can't make loans that small, and who would do this in the first place? But I was very intrigued, and I was sort of at the end of my journalism newspaper rope, and I thought, what do I have to lose? You know, if I go to Bangladesh and take a look for myself, the worst I'll get out of it is an interesting trip to Asia, to a country that I probably would never otherwise get to. So I saved up a few $1,000s, and I went to Bangladesh. I read everything I'd come across on Bangladesh and women's development and economic development, and I went there. And I remember landing in Dhaka and walking out of the airport. The air was very smoky. It was about 5 a.m. when I arrived, and the airport was just surrounded by beggars. Thousands or hundreds and hundreds of people begging. That's what happens, because Bangladesh is a whole development economy. And I remember thinking, what have I done? This is the dumbest decision I've ever made. And after recovering from jet lag, I went to the Grameen Bank's head office, and I met Muhammad Yunus, who was the co-recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. And he said to me, well, if you want to understand our work, you just have to go to a village. Go find a translator. I went out. I spent 3 days interviewing translators. I found a young college student. And then we just went to a village, and I spent the next 4 months with this translator going from one village to another, interviewing borrowers of the Grameen Bank. And I began seeing that, okay, there's a bunch of things that I should really look at here. One of that is, how do they actually, are people really benefiting from this idea? The second question is, how does this organization work? How do you create a bank that can deal with people in villages? And the third question was, once I was satisfied that the two questions, I was beginning to understand them, the third one was, how does an organization like this get created in the first place? And when I went to Bangladesh, my assumption was that the Grameen Bank had been created by the World Bank, or perhaps had been created by the United Nations. Because my assumption was that all social change in the world has to start from governments or United Nations kind of organizations. That's their job. They're supposed to solve problems. But what I discovered was that, in fact, the Grameen Bank had just been started by one person, by Muhammad Yunus. And when I started interviewing him, I realized that he was just like all the people I had studied in my business classes at McGill. He had all of the same characteristics of the entrepreneur, and he even asked questions the same way. When I asked him questions, he immediately went into problem solving, which is a classic tactic of the entrepreneur. They're always looking to solve problems. They're always thinking about, how do I collect resources? How do I recruit more people? He tried to recruit me to get involved in the Grameen, and I remember thinking, so we have an entrepreneur here, and we have this social organization, which is really about alleviating poverty, and I began seeing that there was something here that I hadn't quite understood. So I went back home, and I spent 2 years getting a book contract and trying to sell magazine articles, came back to Bangladesh, spent another 5 months in villages, and wrote a book called The Price of a Dream, which looked at the Grameen Bank, how it had evolved, and the conclusion of that book was that Muhammad Yunus was an entrepreneur, but an entrepreneur that we don't often see or hear talked about in popular discourse. He was a social entrepreneur, and his sole goal was, his primary goal, as he describes it, is to put poverty in the museum. So that one day our great-grandchildren, or perhaps our grandchildren, will have to go to a museum to see or read about the fact that one day There was a time in world history when a large portion of the people in the world didn't have enough to eat. And they'll read about that the way we read about fossils, and they'll think, or dinosaurs. Did they really exist? And he talked about this, and he said, and these are the mechanisms by which we have to attack this. The first one is we have to make sure that everybody in the world who wants to work, who has a skill, who has an idea, has a little bit of capital in order to make good on that idea. And most of the women that I had seen in the Grameen Bank were micro entrepreneurs. They had Bangladesh, most of the economy are people who work for themselves. It's not like the United States where after you graduate from school, you look for a job, and only 1 out of 6 people go and start their own business. In Bangladesh, 5 out of 6 people, probably more than that, essentially have to create their own jobs, and only a tiny percentage of the country can go and count upon a job from a company or a civil service job. And so with tiny loans, on average $100 a year, what you had were people going out and purchasing bamboo and weaving stools. People would purchase repair kits and become the radio repairmen for the village. People would sell popsicles. They would start transport businesses. I mean, the Grameen Bank's annual report showed more than 450 different business activities, and it indicated the number of women and the number of men who had participated in each different type of business activity. I remember reading through this report and thinking, this is another way to look at a country, through all of the business activities of all of the women, mostly women, because the Grameen Bank lends money to 95% of its clients are women. Today, incidentally, it has 7 million borrowers, and it's lent $7 billion. Looking at the country through this lens of all of the entrepreneurial ability, I remembered thinking that before I had gone to Bangladesh, my image of the country was of incapacity, was of people begging for rice, because the US Marines had landed because of the latest cyclone, and they were sort of standing there like this, and the US Marines were handing down bales of rice to them, or bags of lentils. I remember thinking, this is a different way of imagining Bangladesh, and if you began with that image of even the poorest country in the world, a country where most of the people don't read, you would construct the solutions very, very differently. So after I finished that book, and I concluded that Yunus was a social entrepreneur, I remember thinking, I wonder if there are other people in the world who are also social entrepreneurs. Is this going on? I certainly hadn't heard about it in the newspapers. And somebody pointed me in the direction of a man named Bill Drayton, who had started an organization called Ashoka, which is has a head office in Washington, D.C. today, but actually today works in more than 70 countries around the world. How many people here have heard of Ashoka? Okay, so that's very, very few people. So I remember being very intrigued by who was this character, Bill Drayton. So I began reading about him, and he had a number of very interesting things that he had done in his life. One of them is, how many of you have heard of the idea of emissions trading, pollution trading, for handling global warming? You can buy and sell credits and so forth. So this was really, Bill worked at the Environmental Protection Agency during the Carter administration, and he was the person who really put forth the idea, which was then called the bubble, which was a pollution trading idea, and was the idea that was really responsible for the reduction of acid rain during the 1990s, and now is the leading idea for dealing with greenhouse gas reduction. So Bill was obviously a very creative thinker. He had worked at McKinsey & Company for 9 years on all sorts of working with governments and also many, many different companies and different industries. And he got this idea in 1980. Actually, he had had the idea for 10 years, but he finally started it in 1980, that social entrepreneurs were going to become powerful actors in the world. That in fact, the 21st century would be the century of the social entrepreneur, and business entrepreneurs would be equally important and perhaps less important than the social entrepreneurs. They would have an ascendance. And so he started Ashoka, which was really modeled after a venture capital firm. It was going to go around the world looking for the best entrepreneurs it could find, where they could make an investment in this entrepreneur. It wasn't an investment to get a financial return. It was they were giving grants out. But the idea was that if we invest in this human being with this idea and their management team, will we get a great institution that will solve a social problem 5 or 10 years down the road? Which is what venture capitalists all around the world do. They try to invest early in an early stage company, hoping that that company will go public and everybody will get very rich. So he started looking for social entrepreneurs in India in 1981, and then he moved to Indonesia after that, and then Brazil, and gradually has gone around the world. And now Ashoka employs a few hundred people, and they've supported 2,000 social entrepreneurs globally. And so what I did was I wrote a book called How to Change the World, and I interviewed 100 of these social entrepreneurs, or they're referred to in Ashoka parlance as Ashoka Fellows. And I have to say, it was kind of it was a life-changing experience for me. If I had read the newspapers every day for 50 years, I don't think I could have seen the world or understood it in the way I do now by having seen it through the work of the Ashoka Fellows. Because I started seeing that the example of Muhammad Yunus and the Grameen Bank was not actually the exception. It was actually happening, really in large numbers of people were doing this kind of work. You could see an explosion of it in India. You could see an explosion of it in Brazil. In the United States, there's always been large numbers of social entrepreneurs, but today it's really taking off. And so I started interviewing them to see if there were patterns in the way they solve problems. So I'll give you an example, because I know that a number of you are engineering students. I'll give you an example of an engineer that I wrote about, a man named Fabio Rosa, who's from Brazil. So Rosa had grown up in Porto Alegre, which is in the southern part of Brazil. He was an engineer, and he was also an agronomist. And he had gone to a Jesuit school, and he really had a strong sense of values, and he wanted to he wanted to change the world. So after graduating, he was given a post in a small municipality, a rural area in southern Brazil. And, he's a good listener, so he said, the first thing I should do before I even have any of my own plans of what I need to do in agriculture or engineering is just to go talk to people. And he thought, by the way, when he went there, he thought, I'm an engineer, we should build roads, because everybody always says they need roads. But when he went and interviewed all the villagers, he said, what's your biggest problem? The villagers said, our biggest problem is water. We can't grow 3 crops of rice a year because we don't have enough water, because the people who control the water are the wealthy landowners, and they charge too high a price, so it pays during certain seasons just to let our land lie fallow. And because of this, so many of these villagers had actually found that their farms were unsustainable, and they had moved to Brazil's cities. They'd moved to the favelas, which are the slums of Brazil. So Brazil has gone in 50 years from being 70% rural to being more than 70% urban, in actually less than 50 years, probably in more like 40 years. And as a result, they have these massive urban slums, shanty towns, which are called favelas, with huge health and crime problems. I'm trying to remember the figure, but I think Rio had thousands of murders last year. I think it had 6,000 murders last year. Don't quote me on that statistic, but the number of people killed in crime-related incidents in Brazilian cities is just ridiculous. So, and it was all of these people having to leave their farms en masse all of a sudden to go to live in cities where the cities did not have time to absorb them. It wasn't like the normal rural to urban migration that you've seen, say, in the United States over the course of a century. So Rosa said, how do I solve the water problem? And he realized that the only way to get water out of the ground as an engineer was to have pumps. And the only way to power these pumps was to have electricity, because all of the other energy sources were too expensive. But this area was one of the parts of Brazil that had never gotten electricity, because 25 million people in Brazil, as recently as 1980, didn't have electricity, because Brazil had never had a New Deal, which is how most people in the United States got electricity, at least in rural areas. So he said, how do we bring electricity to all of these people so they can get water? And he thought about this problem for several months, and then one day he was watching a television show, and he saw an interview with a man who was a professor at a local institute who had developed what he called a monophase electrical distribution system. He used just one wire to bring electricity to rural properties. It was very inexpensive. It was grounded in the soil. He used scaled-down transformers. He made his transformers out of milk cartons, 5-gallon milk jugs. And he asked villagers, when he needed to get the work done, he asked them to put up the trees and to wire it themselves. And using this system, which had a lower electricity power ability to handle less power, using this system, it was perfectly adequate for local farmers' needs, and it brought down the price dramatically. So Rosa saw this idea. Now this professor, his name was Ennio Amaral, had been working on this idea for 10 years, but he had never managed to actually roll it out in society because he was an inventor. And the problem with rolling out this idea in Brazilian society was that all of the electricity distribution in Brazil was controlled by the state governments at the time. They owned power companies and they had monopolies. And every time Ennio tried to get them to adopt his system, they weren't interested, and the cement cartels, which had and the companies that manufactured the normal size transformers had no interest in scaling down their operations because it would really undercut their business. So the whole idea was it just didn't move at all. Rosa saw this and he said, how do we make this idea happen? And in some sense, when I was interviewing him, I saw this is really kind of the mentality of the entrepreneur, being a problem solver. He realized there was an engineering solution, but to move that forward, there needed to be some political movement as well. So he actually spent a year traveling around the state and talking to every single mayor of every municipality in Porto Alegre state. And he convinced them that this was an idea that they should try out. And he went to the press and he got enough journalists to sort of write articles about it that eventually, and he went to the Brazilian National Development Bank and he convinced them that this would be a good investment, that people actually would really benefit from the electricity and they'd be able to pay back the loans if they lent them the money. This took him a long time, a lot of conversations, a lot of persuasion, but eventually he was successful and he got enough money to install this project. He got permission from the government to reach 400 rural properties. At the time, the Brazilian government spent $7,000 for each electricity installation in Brazil. This was in 1982. And the annual income in Brazil was around $2,000. So this was way out of range for poor people. The average annual income was $2,000. So Rosa developed this model. He got villagers excited about building it themselves, and he ended up installing 400 rural properties at an average price of $400 each. So $16,000 for the whole thing. And what he found was that immediately, as soon as they got electricity, the villagers were very excited. The first thing that they bought was a water pump, of course. The next thing that they bought was an electric shower heater, so that they didn't have to take freezing cold showers in the winter, in the Brazilian winter. And then they bought a television set, of course, and later on. And nowadays, by the way, it's cell phone chargers, it's all sorts of other things. So people were very excited. He actually found that people moved back from the favelas back onto their land. Now this was historically, those of you who study global demographic patterns know that urban to rural migration almost never happens. So the fact that he was able to show that if you create a livelihood for people, that in fact it might slow down some of the rural-urban migration was a groundbreaking insight. So then he got very excited. He went back to the bank and he said, let's spread it. So over the next couple of years, they actually spread it to thousands more, 28,000 more properties, and the price went up to $600 with inflation. Then he got involved, and he realized we have to do this at a much larger level. So he started engaging the state governments and showing them that it was in their interest, and showing them that some of their employees would be very excited to see that they could actually bring electricity to all of these people who would be so much more grateful than the people who lived in the cities. And through this process, which took 10 years, this idea, which became called the 025 norm in Brazil, became part of the national legislative framework for electrical distribution. In other words, it was legal to do this. The states now had this as a blueprint, and it spread over the course of 10 years to 1 million people across the country. And Rosa, remember when I interviewed Rosa, he was very excited. When I first interviewed him in 1997, he was very excited because he said, we're up at 1 million, I think we'll be at 25 million in 10 years. He thought the whole country was going to be electrified. I remember thinking, wow, that's really exciting. So I went back to interview him a few years later to see how did it go. And he said to me, oh, I've got to start at scratch. He told me, he said he felt like Sisyphus. He'd been working on this idea for 15 years, pushing the boulder up to the top of the mountain, and the boulder had rolled back all the way to the beginning. And this is actually part of the process of entrepreneurship I've discovered. Failure is as common as success. And it's the way people actually respond to failure that largely determines whether they continue on and really have success, have larger success. So Rosa said that what had happened is in the intervening years, all of Brazil's state electric companies, which were interested now in rural electrification, and where there was money from the state to support this, had been privatized, right? Privatization is a good thing, right? They'd been sold off mostly to European companies who were managing the electrical distribution, and the European companies were very smart. They realized that there's a much better market if you sell electricity in the favelas, in the slums, where for every square kilometer you have potentially hundreds or thousands of customers, rather than selling it in rural areas where you might have one. So they completely cut off all interest in rural electrification. And I remember saying to Rose, I said, I just remember feeling my heart drop when he told me this, thinking, oh my goodness, all of this work, all of these people, and it's just the companies aren't going to do it. He said, no, it's not going to happen, but I have another idea. And I've been working on it because I expected that this was going to happen. The winds of neoliberalism were very well known in Brazil, so he kind of anticipated that. And he said, I have a new project. I'm going to bring solar electricity across all of Brazil, and I'm going to make sure, I'm going to reach as many people as I can, millions of people. And I remember thinking, how are you going to do this? You can't possibly get solar electricity across Brazil. Everybody knows that solar energy is way too expensive. And, you know, I mean, it's just not a model that anyone has been able to do at massive scale. And he said, do you own a computer? And I said, yes. And he said, well, why do you own it? And I said, because I make money from the computer. I use it to earn more money. And he said, well, we're always selling electricity to people as something that they need to consume. We actually have to think of it as something that will allow them to produce more, and we have to package it. So we started doing all this packaging of electricity, solar electricity, with something that a villager could use to increase their income. So there's many, many examples of this, but I'll give you one basic example. So Brazil has an enormous area of the country that's all grasslands, huge meat production. But what often happens is that farmers actually get very low yields because they don't actually use the grass properly. And there's a kind of system of grassland use which is called rotational grazing. If any of you have ever studied voisin rotational grazing, which I'm sure none of you have studied, but I studied it, it's this method by which if you move animals around a paddock in systematic fashion, you can dramatically increase the quality of the meat and the quantity of milk that they produce, if it's cattle, for example. So Rosa said, we're going to get people doing this. He said, but there's a big problem. It's the fencing. The fencing has always been too expensive for people to do this. We can't afford these very expensive fences, so that's why they've never done it, even though many Brazilian farmers know about this technique. So he said, but electrical fencing is very cheap. It's just a thin wire. So I said, well, hasn't this been tried? He said, yes, they tried to do it 30 years ago, but they didn't understand that they used European machines, and the grass grows taller in Brazil, and when the grass touches the fence, it drains the current, and the fences never worked, and so everybody abandoned them. So he developed a new machine. So this idea seemed half-cocked, I have to tell you. I didn't really expect it to go very far. But over the next 5 years, he spread this idea to 16 states and thousands of farms across Brazil that were using solar electric fencing to increase their milk yields and their meat yields on their cattle. Then he came up with another idea. He realized, after dealing with poor people for a long period of time, that in fact, most of them spent a lot of money. They actually spent more money on energy needs than a solar system would cost. And I remember asking him, how do you know this? He said, well, if you ask a poor person how many candles you burn every month, how much petroleum gas you use for your gas lighting, how many batteries you use for your radios, and you ask them to add it up every month, it sometimes turns out that they're spending $15 or $20 a month on these non-renewable energy sources which pollute, contribute to global warming, and also contribute to ill health in the household. He said, now if we create a whole solar system that sells for $450 with panels, with 12-volt light bulbs, with a cell phone charger, with outlets for television, we can sell the whole thing for $480 or $520, And if people pay us back $20 a month or $15 a month, we can have a payback period of less than 4 years. We can actually include an internal rate of return of 25 or 30% in there so that it's actually a self-sustaining business. And he said the difference is that nobody has ever leased solar electricity to poor people. We always tell them to buy it. And then he asked me, he said, how do you pay your electricity bill in New York? And I said, I pay Con Ed every month. He said, if Con Ed told you that you needed to pay for the next 25 years of electricity right now, would you be able to do it? And I said, probably not. He said, well, that's what we're asking a poor person to do when we sell them a solar system, which lasts 25 years. We're asking them to pay all this money up front. And he said, so we're going to create a rental system. So he went out and he created this whole business model and went out and raised money. And now this business model is spreading to, initially with hundreds of families, but this model is actually being adopted in many different countries, this solar rental system. Now, the interesting thing about this, in every example of social entrepreneurship that I found, there's always these make or break details that can screw up the whole thing if you don't get them. So in a solar energy system, it turns out that if you look at systems around the world and you want to try to find out why most of them fail, and we all want solar electricity to happen in the world. There's 2 billion people around the world that still don't have electricity, and decentralized energy generation from the sun just makes the most sense. Okay? So we want this to happen. What's the global problem for solar electricity generation? It turns out it's the battery. The battery wears out. And this is basically what happens. You go to a person and you say to them, if you buy this system, you'll have 7 hours of light every night, but then the battery wears out and they only start getting 2 or 3 hours of light every night, and then they stop paying you if they think that you ripped them off. And why does the battery start wearing out? Well, this is a typical scenario. You have your solar system, and then your sister's getting married. So you unhook the battery, and you use it to play the music at the wedding. Everybody's dancing, and at 2 a.m., everything goes out, and you've completely drained the charge on the battery because you've brought it below the 20% threshold. And then the battery never recovers a proper charge, and the battery's expensive. And you hook it back up to your system, and it's like your laptop battery. It used to give you 4 hours, and now it's only giving you 45 minutes, and you're very frustrated. So this was happening actually across the world. So Rosa said, how do we protect the battery? So he actually spent a year designing a whole protection system for the battery. I mean, you think about the level of thinking that goes into this. He designed a box that you could put the battery in that would raise it off the floor so the humidity wouldn't disturb it. He created a seal that if you broke the seal, it would be seen that you had broken your contract. But then he did something that I think is just kind of brilliant. He would ask everybody what their religion was, who they, in Brazil there's African religions, Candomblé, there's Lutherans, there's Catholicism, and he would say, who's your favorite saint? And then he would be told the favorite saint, and he would put a doll of the saint on top of the battery. He'd bolt it to the top of the battery box. And then he would tell people, he would say, this is your energy source. Think of it as sacred. If you respect this energy source, your children will not have to breathe in the smoke from lamps. They'll be from gas lamps. They'll be healthier. You'll have lights. You'll have a future. Your kids will be able to read at night. And because of this, I think, deeply respectful approach, and this comes from hundreds of conversations with people to really understand how things are happening, he hasn't had any of the problems that have plagued thousands of solar projects around the world. He's really bypassed a lot of those problems. Now, he still has a lot of problems. It's a difficult business to run. Raising capital is the biggest difficulty. But if you think about this as a model, and remember that 2 billion people around the world don't have electricity, won't be getting it from the grid, because extension of the grid, probably there's not enough investment to happen, you can think, well, maybe this is actually the solution to the world's electricity problems, at least for a third of the world's electricity problems, small-scale electricity generation. So that's just one story. Picture the story of the Grameen Bank and the picture of Fabio Rosa, and then multiply in your minds 100 or 1,000 stories with that level of creativity and that level of problem solving. Let's see how much time we have. I think I'll tell one more quick story, just to give a sense of what's happening in the United States. There's a man that I recently interviewed whose story I think is just wonderful. His name is Gerald Chertavian. and he started an organization called Year Up. And Gerald's a really interesting guy. He studied business. He worked on Wall Street. He was making a lot of money in basically managing, doing credit research for a lot of the big banks. And then he went and started his own business, and he sold it, and he was independently wealthy. And he said that when he sold his business, he was kind of at a crisis. He actually felt scared. He said, I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. I didn't have to work anymore. And he said, and I spent 6 months just thinking about who was I, and what are the things that had always really interested me? What are my deepest passions? What's the through line in my life? If I look back when I was a college student. And so he began realizing that the thing that he had always done and always loved most was he had always been a big brother. When he started off as an undergraduate at Bowdoin College in Maine. He was a big brother to a young boy in that town. When he was working on Wall Street, he was a big brother to a boy named David, who grew up in a poor family, and he helped him get into college and find a career. And he always just loved mentoring other young men. So he thought, and I'm good at building businesses. I have a talent for starting organizations. So he created this organization called Year Up. And his idea was, how do I make sure that more young people who have talent have an ability to show that talent, are able to work in corporate America? So he decided that since he understood business, he understood Wall Street, he'd start working with large banks. And he would go to them and say, what kind of people do you need to work in your bank? That you could give them a starting salary of $40,000 or $35,000, which is probably double what a young person who's working as a security guard or maybe working at a fast food chain is earning. A lot of these kids that he's talking about, they don't even have a high school diploma. So they told him the kinds of jobs that might be available as a starting job. And he designed a one-year program, which he calls Year Up, which involved 6 months of a training course, and then 6 months of an internship where you're working in one of these companies. And the idea is to take somebody, get him through high school equivalency, place him in Wall Street, and hopefully at the end of the year, get him a job offer. Okay, this might seem like a really, really tough sell, right? Doesn't seem like it'll work. So they've worked with 1,000 kids now, and they have a 90% success rate. 90% of them go on to either getting a job on Wall Street or they end up going to college after they graduate from Year Up. So how do they do it? So and Gerald is a very intuitive person. He's very charismatic. He was always the salesperson company. He was going out talking to people. You could tell that he really knew how to relate to people. And so he said, well, so a lot of these kids come in here, and for this first 6 months, there's a lot of basic things that they have to learn. There's basic skills and all that. But he gave me an example. The first day that I had to interview him, I was running late. And so I called him just while I was getting into the subway in New York, and I said, I'm going to be 10 minutes late. He came back to me in the interview. He said, how did you know to do that? That's a skill. How do you know that you're supposed to call ahead and say, I'm running 10 minutes late? Who taught you that? He said, somewhere along the line in life, somebody said to you, that's what you do if you want to make sure that people want to work with you. You can't just show up late and not tell them. He says, these kinds of skills are the kinds of things that we have to teach young people. He gave me another example. He said, if you're walking down the street in Harlem and you make eye contact with somebody like that, it's interpreted as a sign of aggression. If you don't make eye contact and you're working at Morgan Stanley, it's seen as disrespect. Okay? So how do you take a whole bunch of people who have grown up in a culture and say, hey, if you're going to work in this environment, you better make eye contact with people. If somebody is speaking to you in a lecture, you have to follow them with your eyes. Otherwise, they think you're bored and they're not going to like you. Other things, how do you give a good handshake? How do you make small talk at the company Christmas party? These are actually all skills that people acquire by being in a culture. So when I was in Bangladesh, I learned very quickly that if you say no to the villager because you've already eaten enough and you'd rather not have this extra plate of food, that you've really humiliated them and hurt their feelings. And no matter how many villagers' houses you've met, you always take the food and you always eat it and completely clean your plate and don't ask what it is. Okay? So how did I learn that? Well, I had a couple of translators who were horrified with me the first time I did it and made sure that I never did it again. And so I had a very early experience in that. But this is part of the normal cultural adaptation process that people go through. And what Gerald has found is that actually all of these people that we think don't have ability, in fact, they've got tons of ability. You know, we just don't see it because these little details of inability to sort of make a connection with other people, you know, these synapses aren't firing. They're being blocked for some reason. And we can very often, with very simple things, train it so that this flows. And so, you know, I went to the Europe graduation, which was in Wall Street, and I saw their class, their most recent class. And so I was going up to the young men and women, and I was interviewing them, and this guy, I got a job offer, $40,000 from this company, $40,000 from this company, $35,000 from this company. Very excited. All their families were there. They were totally thrilled. Everybody who shook my hand was like looking me in the eye, like the firmest handshake you've ever had. And Gerald, who has this ability to sort of grow it, he's raising $18 million in capital to spread. He's in 4 cities now. He wants to be in 10 cities and then 20 cities. He's got this whole growth thing. He says our target market are 4 million youth in the country between the ages of 18 and 24 who are underemployed. And we believe that we can reach a very significant percentage of that market. We have the model now. They need growth funding and so forth. The companies pay them to get these. They pay them half the kids' training costs because they love getting these very motivated young employees. And he's dealing with a problem that, in some ways, very, very few organizations around the country have really figured out how to solve. So, and that's the kind of thing that's happening. So if I interviewed Gerald and I said, you started a business and you were successful, and now you started Year Up and it's going well, what's the comparison? And he said, you know, the business was great. I'm glad that I did it. I always needed to, I was always worried about, you know, I didn't want to be anxious about money. I wanted to have enough money in my life. He says, but this is really what's fulfilled me in life. I have to say that this is more challenging, more difficult, and it's also more fulfilling than anything I've ever done before. Now, if you can think of these examples and then step back a bit and think, there's this landscape of institutions that's emerging around the world today, and we're not talking about a few. We're talking about the .orgs being a larger phenomenon than the .coms ever were. There's a lot more of them out there, and increasingly the .coms are going to be social enterprises. You're going to see a lot of socially organized business and so forth. And now when I travel around the country, I see young people and also people in their 60s and 70s in their encore careers starting organizations and pursuing careers of social impact. And personally, I don't really know why this is happening now. I mean, I think historians will probably write about it and see that something has shifted at the beginning of the 21st century in the way people define success and in the landscape of opportunities that are available to people as they pursue their careers. So, but I do think that to not be aware of social entrepreneurship in 2008 is like not being aware of the internet in 1996. You can have a good life, but you just will not understand the full range of opportunities that are available to you. And opportunities really to be very deeply fulfilled in your work, not to just have it as a day job where you make your money, but to be doing the kind of work that on a day-to-day basis your colleagues turn you on, you really love working with them, you feel that you're using your talents in a way that's really making a contribution, and you really feel, I guess the word is fully expressed. So I'm going to stop now. Just going back to that quote, the way people imagine the world determines what they'll do. I think that if you look into the field of social entrepreneurship through organizations like Ashoka and many others that are supporting social entrepreneurs, there's a lot of stories there that can help you reimagine the world and in some ways reimagine pathways for your futures. So thanks very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the stories, and I look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.
The United States is no stranger to poverty either, and you look at areas like the Appalachian area.
Can you speak a little louder?
Yeah. The United States is no stranger to poverty, and you look at the areas like the Appalachian areas, for example, and some of the conditions that those people live in. I guess my question is, are you aware of social entrepreneurs who might be working in that arena, and also, do you believe that microfinance can work in the U.S. in much the same way it's worked in Bangladesh?
So yeah, there is social entrepreneurship. There are examples that I've read about. I don't have any off the top of my head. Working in Appalachia, economic development. Basically, what you find is, I mean, social entrepreneurs work in very strongly in the United States in the health system, trying to improve the health system, trying to improve public schooling, and a lot of basically economic development, fixing broken government systems like the foster care system, which is just a disaster, or the prison system, where you have 70% recidivism rates, which are just, it's just insane that you spend so much money and you don't get any benefit for it. It's really just across the board. Appalachia is just, you know, one region. You see very, very deep pockets of social entrepreneurs all around the country. But really where you see it very profoundly is, it's right now there's a lot of bi-coastal stuff happening. There's a lot of stuff happening on the East Coast and on the West Coast. And in the middle of the country, there seems to be less of it happening, and I'm not really sure why that is. It might have to do just with communication channels and who knows each other, and so forth. What was your other question again? Microfinance. Yeah. So microfinance exists in the United States, but the United States is not a self-employment economy by and large. Most people still make their way out of poverty by getting a college education, okay? Because if you get a college education, you have all these options. You don't get a college education or a high school education, you don't. So microfinance has worked as a way to supplement a lot of people who want to have a home-based business. It's worked with tens of thousands of people, but it's not a mass strategy in the United States. What you do find a lot of in the United States are people who are trying to undercut predatory lending, which is an enormous problem in our economy. If you're poor and you need a payday loan, you might end up paying an effective interest rate, which they don't call an interest rate, they call it a service charge. They're not allowed to call it an interest rate because the effective interest rate would be 400% a year if you think of your 2-week loan in terms of the fees that you have to pay. So there's lots of people who are providing fair, reasonably priced access to credit to low-income people and expanding, trying to mainstream people. I'll give you one example. There's a company called PRBC. It stands for Pay, Rent, Build Credit. So anybody here who has a credit score, I have a credit score, it's largely based on the repayment of loans you've taken, mortgages, stuff like that. But you could be paying your rent and your Con Ed bill, that's your electricity bill, and your phone bill for 10 years, never been late with a payment, and you don't have a credit score, which is what a lot of probably 25, 30 million people in the United States fall into that category. So what PRBC does is they say, hey, let's gather this information, turn it into a number, connect with the big credit companies, the big three, and use this data as a way to make much smarter evaluations of credit risk so you can mainstream credit to all of these people who should not be paying the interest rates that they're paying. And it's working very well.
I'd be curious in your observations in other countries where the social infrastructure is richer, deeper, thicker, more abundant through government programming. Do you also see this phenomenon of social entrepreneurship that you're describing, that you're seeing here?
Where governments play a bigger role?
Right. Like if you take Europe or even Canada.
Well, it's very different. I mean, so in a country like Bangladesh, which is essentially probably a failed state in some sense, the social entrepreneurs like the Grameen Bank and BRAC, which is the other huge social organization, have essentially done what the government should be doing or what we'd expect the government to do, providing educational services to millions of people and so forth, health services and so forth. So in the United States, the role of the social entrepreneurs is different. What you really need to do to see massive change in this country is really to get innovation into the DNA of public systems. So you have a lot of people who are working with the public hospital system, with public education, trying to bring, like College Summit, which is an organization that I write about in my book, How to Change the World, is an organization that's trying to increase the college access rate for low-income high school graduates, okay, which is currently in the United States only 46%. You're a high school graduate, from the lowest quarter of the population income-wise, your chance of going to college is the same as if, if you're from the lowest quarter of the population and you're an A student, your chance of going to college is the same as if you're from the highest quarter of the population and you're a D student. So the worst rich kids go to college at the same rate as the best poor kids, okay? So they're saying, hey, why are these kids going to college at such a low rate? And so they've gone into the public school systems now, and they're working in 6 cities, and they've tweaked the messaging in those systems. They've created a whole series of interventions. I won't go into the details, but they're able to bring the college enrollment rate up to 80% for the students that they work with, as compared to 46%. They say you earn $1 million on average more over your life if you go to college as compared to only graduating from high school. It's a very, very significant intervention. But they can't do it without working with the public schools. They have to work with 80,000 schools in this country. It's crazy. Charter schools are doing great work, showing what's possible, but you ultimately have to change the public systems in a country like the United States, or where I come from, Canada, where the public systems are even more dominant. Well, it depends. In some places around the world, social entrepreneurs have been, in the worst case scenario, they've been killed. And in the best case scenario, they're able to align what they're doing with the political wins that are possible for governments. So ultimately, in order to get governments to at least not obstruct what you're doing, you need to show them that they'll get what they need. And what political people need is political currency, which is good newspaper articles, which is basically some sign that they're doing good work, that they'll get more votes. It's very possible, for governments to take that credit. So, for example, one of the organizations I wrote about in How to Change the World is called Childline. It's an organization in India that provides child protection services to street kids across the country. It does very, very good work. It works in 70 cities. Childline is now considered a project of the government, of the Indian government, of the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment. And they always give the credit to the ministry whenever they have a newspaper article about them. They say, well, the ministry has done this and the ministry has done this. The ministry has not really done anything. The ministry has provided legitimacy, and all the work is being done by these people on the ground who are part of the Childline network. A lot of them are street kids, by the way. They do a lot of the work themselves as volunteers. So if governments will oppose to the degree that you're causing them political pain, okay? Governments will not oppose to the degree that you're actually aligning with what they need. And to the degree that social entrepreneurs do that, they're able to work within systems. But there's a lot of opposition and resistance, as you can well imagine, around the world.
You mentioned that you weren't sure why there was such an explosion of social entrepreneurship in the world. What impact do you think 9/11 has had in that, in this country at least?
Good question. A lot of this was happening before 9/11. So I think, if anything, it may have accelerated it. I know that I have met a bunch of people who felt that for them it was a real turning point in the way that they saw the world. And they realized that they were galvanized into action. I think that the driving forces are more historic, though. I think that global awareness of problems, the fact that an average person today has more information than a head of state did 20 years ago, the fact that more people have access to, more people see themselves as socially mobile, not only in the United States but globally. More women around the world everywhere have confidence to go and do things. Most of the social entrepreneurs that I've written about in India, if you went back to the 70s, probably wouldn't have conceived themselves in that role as recently as 30 years ago because of expectations, social expectations. So I think the women's revolution is probably the #1 reason to half the planet having more of a sense of their agency, I guess you could think. I think the rise of a global middle class is a great accelerating factor, and the rise of global media. And I think also the failure of of so many states to really deal with their problems effectively, and the blind spots that the business sector has to so many social ills that are, sort of blindly obvious to people. So there's a great need, perception of the need is great, and the demand of people who can meet that need. So I guess the supply of people who can meet that people and the demand for their talents. If we think in economics terms, you have a supply curve going up and the demand curve going up on both counts. And I think that you would see that's what's producing a lot of this. No, well,
The Grameen Bank is a
yeah.
Bank is a non-profit, and I think Muhammad Yunus himself believes that.
It's for profit, actually.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
for profit, and Muhammad Yunus himself, I think, believes it's for profit, it's sustainable over the long term. You see that as being a trend of social entrepreneurship rather than launching non-profits where you have a dependency on donations and benefactors, more so than launching a for-profit type of businesses where they can develop sustainable revenue streams while at the same time delivering to the social.
Yeah.
How do you see the trend?
You're going to see all of it. I mean, there's definitely a role for, Yunus talks about social enterprises. He calls them non-loss companies, where you can cap profits or you can let them go freely. You can have non-profits. There's certain things you cannot capture revenues. The basic presumption of a business is that typically you capture your revenues from the beneficiary. I sell you something, you benefit, you pay me. But very often in a social business, the person who's paying and the person who's benefiting are two different people. I might be buying a college access program for this young person over here if I make a grant to the organization. So there's going to be huge roles for nonprofits. You cannot always capture profits, and you certainly can't always capture them within the timeline that's necessary for investors, which tends to be, payback of 7, 8 years, whatever that is. So you're going to see both of them, and increasingly in the future, you're going to see what are coming to be known as BCorporations in the United States, or for-benefit corporations, which are businesses, but they enjoy some of the tax advantages that we've historically given nonprofits. So in some sense, they make lower returns, but the after-tax returns may be more competitive with a purely for-profit business, and they have to be businesses that have a very clear primary social objective. So England has this now. Canada's toying with it. Some states in the United States, you can do this on the books, only I think in 30 states. But there are movements to try to sort of devise legal structures that will enable people who want to be social entrepreneurs but feel that business is the way to do it. By the way, clean tech, a lot of the great changes in clean technology are going to come through business. The marketing of better energy technologies and water-saving technologies and so forth. So I think that you're going to see a lot of it. And increasingly, you're going to see intrapreneurship as a very strong career. So a lot of you are going to go into large companies probably. And if you can change the decision-making process in General Electric, for example, or any large company in terms of what they factor in when they make a decision, what they count, what they think is valuable, you can have enormous impact working within the corporate sector. So a man named Andrew Shapiro started a company called Green Order, used that company as a way to influence the behavior of General Electric in terms of how they think about the manufacturing processes, and has had a huge impact. So I would consider him sort of you can be an entrepreneur working within companies as well. Yeah, you can work within governments too, government agencies. How often? Yeah. Well, I think it really depends on the person. There are some people who are they have private sector chips in their brains. They really love business. The idea of having to go out and raise money and ask people for money for foundation grants and so forth, they find humiliating. They find it distasteful. They want to have their own money. They're not interested. And so they go out and they'll start a social business. There's an organization called the Acumen Fund, which is a fantastic organization. It's a non-profit venture capital firm, but they only make equity and loans to for-profit companies in the developing world. And those companies have to be doing something that's beneficial for poor people in the areas of health, housing, or water. So the company that is manufacturing the long-lasting bed nets to prevent against malaria is a company, has a price point, and is selling these bed nets to large numbers of people in Africa. It's a business. It has to be run as a business because you need to be able to raise more money. There's millions of people who need bed nets, and there's not that much grant money. On the other hand, if you're working with foster care or human rights or something like that, it's going to be very, very difficult. And if that's your passion, to figure this out in a business context. There's just not a paying customer sometimes.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
we'll let you go on out to your
Okay.
table.